Good evening, and welcome to tonight's conversation in response to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and the subsequent cover-up of that murder. On February 23rd, two white men got into a pickup truck, followed and chased Ahmaud, shot him, and killed him for no other reason than the color of his skin. He was jogging. No arrests were made, no prosecution brought. We're likely only having a conversation tonight, and only arrests were made eventually because a video was released last week. After that video was released, the nation immediately began to try to figure out and explain away and justify this crime, to figure out how Ahmaud might have been actually the responsible one, and how these two white men who committed this act of murder might have been victims. In grief and outrage, the leadership of Auburn Public Theater reached out to Black women leaders in our community, to mothers, and asked them, what do we do? What does a conversation look like at this time? Tonight, and the subsequent two conversations that will follow on the following two Saturdays, is a result of their vision and their leadership. Those leaders chose to have a conversation that is three parts. One tonight, which consists of white men drawn across from a cross-section of the community, from education to journalism to politics to the faith community. To next week, when we will talk with Black men, and they'll have a conversation with one another, leaders also in our community. And then a third conversation when we will come together and have a conversation with one another. Now, it might seem odd to have a conversation first with white men only. The reason for that, I believe, is because the problem starts with us, white men. And so the conversation needs to be had among white men. We started this problem. We perpetuate it, whether unconsciously or consciously, as white men, and we have systemically benefited from it. There's white men who killed Ahmaud, white men who failed to make the arrest and prosecution, white men who created this world and perpetuate this world of racial injustice. And so we need to step up. It is not the responsibility of people of color to fix this. We made the problem. And so we need to step up to fix this, to protect our sons and our daughters, our neighbors, all people from this violence and this racial injustice that is perpetrated on a daily basis. I want to thank tonight, particularly Angela Dadabo and Auburn Public Theater, Carrie Idle, who is running our tech right now, the Harriet Tubman Troupe that envisioned this, and the women, the leaders without whom tonight would not be possible, and who every day work and speak and brave to fight this injustice. Gwen Weber-McLeod, Dr. Rhoda Overstreet Wilson, Dr. Johanna Rogers, and Melody Smith Johnson. We love you and we thank you. Now, I am conscious, as I know my peers tonight are, that we are white men. And it's with that privilege and the limitations of that conversation, that prism, that we view the world. And so, as white men, I can promise you that there is a very good chance, and probably not a chance, but a guarantee, that we're going to get some stuff wrong tonight, or at least incomplete. And because no matter how much we are trying to be conscious of that prism and to unpack it and expand it as we should, it's still our prism. And there are experiences and perspectives that we don't have and that we don't get. And so this is a living conversation. It lives on through next Saturday and the subsequent Saturday. It has been happening for centuries prior to tonight and will go on. And we want your comments. We want you to engage us on Facebook, to post comments and questions, to hold us accountable, to challenge us so that we can continue to be in conversation with one another, to have conversations that heal and grow all of us. I would like now to welcome our guests tonight for our panel. I want to welcome Terry Cuddy and Ian Phillips and Dave Tobin. We're going to be on our panel tonight and speaking with us. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend.
You're welcome. It's so good to be with you tonight. We have a difficult conversation ahead of us, but such an important one. And we want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. You were chosen because leadership, Black woman leadership in this community, felt that you have something important to say on this subject and regard you as allies in this fight. And so we hold that with great humility and consciousness of our own limitations, as well as honor. And so thank you for being willing to kick off this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So first we want to know a little bit about who you are. So I'm going to invite you to tell us who you are briefly. And in that, I would also like you to share with us what your motivation was for participating in this process. Why are you here tonight? As well as to describe for us a moment when you realized that these kinds of conversations like we're having tonight and we're going to have next Saturday and the subsequent Saturday, when you realize that these conversations are pivotal to healing. Dave, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Dave Tobin. I lived and worked in Auburn for a couple of decades as a journalist for the Citizen Post-Standard, and I live now in Marcellus in a very rural setting, and I miss the diversity and the ease of connecting with diverse people that Auburn presented me. I'm very grateful to the Tubman Troupe for initiating this. I feel, challenged by this. I guess talking about racism as a white male, I suppose there's a deep inclination to preemptively sort of defend myself. And yet the invitation has been, well, let me just stop, Patrick. Do we want to continue introducing each of us? Let me stop there and let others introduce themselves. I think that's a good idea.
Sure, we can do that. And then you want to come back to share a moment when you realized the importance of these conversations? Okay, let's do that. Thank you, Dave. Then Ian, could you tell us who you are and why you're here tonight?
My name is Ian Phillips. Born and raised in Auburn, New York. Had the good fortune to kind of live in other parts of the country for school, and then in in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Detroit, as a teacher in Detroit. I'm currently a member of the Auburn School Board, and I'm the chair of the Cuyahoga County Democratic Committee.
And Ian, what brings you here tonight?
I am coming at this from a place of humility. I think I have deep respect for the people who invited me to be a part of this conversation. I do try to live by the ethos of, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, that you've chosen the side of the oppressor. So as a white man, it is easy to duck out of these conversations, these uncomfortable conversations. But if we do that, then we are aiding and abetting those who do harm more directly. So I'm humbled by the invitation, and I hope I can contribute something to this conversation.
Amen to that, Ian. And Terry, could you introduce yourself and tell us why you're here tonight?
Yes, thank you, Reverend. And I'd like to thank Angela and the Tubman Troupe, the organizers of the event, for inviting me here. I am a teacher at CUDA Onondaga BOCES, and I'm also an Auburn City Councilor. And I too am humbled by the invitation, and I wanted to be a part of the invitation, be a part of this event because of my initial outrage and horror of the murder. And I just when I was invited, my immediate response was yes. And I know that it's a difficult place to put myself in, but anything I could do to, again, as Ian said, not be silent, and to share my feelings about how this injustice continues to happen. And I keep on saying, not again, not again, not again. I don't want to have to say that anymore.
Amen to that as well. And thank you, Terry. And I'll introduce myself as well. I'm Patrick Heery, and I'll be your moderator tonight. And I'm the pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Auburn, New York. I also have the honor of serving on our county's NAACP board as the religious chair and assistant secretary, and on our Human Rights Commission. I also am a father, and all those many identities and many others bring me here tonight. If you hear any background sounds of children screaming or playing, that's why. I apologize. And I'm here because I'm angry and I'm afraid. My son is biracial African American. My brother is African American. My niece and nephew are biracial African American. I'm afraid for them. I'm afraid for my friends. I'm afraid for the violence and the privilege and the injustice that is exercised every day, that silences and dehumanizes. And I'm here because I know I'm a part of this, and whether I want to be or not, and I've benefited from it, and even if unconsciously, I perpetuate it. And so got to step up and be a part of trying to heal this. And I'm here because, as someone of faith, Ahmaud is a child of God for me, an image of God, a sacred expression of divine love. And on February 23rd, and every day since, and probably for many days in his life long before, that sacred expression that he was and was violated, hurt, and killed. And we've got to do something about that for Ahmaud and for so many others who face this every day. So that's why I'm here. And now I want to go back to that question, which was, when did you learn, or how did you learn, that these kinds of conversations that we're having tonight, these uncomfortable, complex, difficult conversations, are so vital to healing? Who would we can just sort of have a conversation here. We don't have to, so we can just dive in. So whoever's ready, dive in.
I'll jump in first. So there's several moments I think that come to mind. I think you opened this by talking about the prism that we view the world through, right? So as I grow up in Auburn and as a white teenager, I see the world a certain way. I go away to school. I'm introduced to more diversity. I move to other cities. I'm introduced to more diversity. And I've had numbers of conversations with coworkers who say that, they said the same idea in a meeting prior to me or another white colleague saying that idea, and it's only listened to. And they would say, I don't know if it was because of the color of my skin or not, but it's a nag that's in the back of their head. The most recent one that really sticks out to me, I work in political campaigns, and I was a community organizer in Philadelphia and knocked on hundreds of doors, thousands of doors during that time and since. And a routine thing for someone to say to me as I left their house and had a conversation with them is, be safe out there. And it was just a friendly thing to me. It was something that was, just go on your way, be safe out there. And I worked with someone who I consider one of the bravest people I know in Auburn, and I see as a bit of a mentor to me, who ran for office recently. And that same phrase was said, be safe out there. And it was taken as a warning because this person was a person of color. When she left those homes, she took that phrase as a warning. And we had a conversation about that. I always thought that that was a friendly expression. And probably when it was directed to me, it was. And maybe sometimes when it was directed at her, it was. But it also might have been a warning. And that nag that is constantly in your head that you don't know as a white man from the prism that you see it in, you walk through the world with the assumption that you rise and fall based on the merits of what you put out into the world, and not having to worry about the biases or more than that the world throws back at you. So I think that when you know more, you do more. And I think we as white people need to make sure that folks who have not had those conversations know how it feels to walk through the world and bring that home for people. And so I think that's what I'm hoping this conversation will start to do.
Ian, that's great. Can I jump in? Just it's really hard it's maybe impossible for me to know what a Black person experiences other than what they tell me. And I'll just cite this story because it kind of dovetails with yours, Ian, and that is that when my kids were little, we brought a girl up through the Fresh Air program from New York City, African-American girl. She was maybe 8 when she started, and she kept coming. And when she aged out of the program, she kept coming. She'd stay with us for months during the summer, all through her high school years. And then she went away to college, and she visited us one Christmas. And we were living in Skaneateles at the time, and we walked into the village and we walked back, and she told me she didn't feel comfortable in where we were because of how people were looking at her. And I felt at a loss then, in a way, because I didn't see what she saw. It wasn't like a direct interaction. We hadn't had those, and I felt, how could I interrupt something I didn't see? So it is with a lot of humility that I'm here and in this conversation, hoping that we generate some ideas how to open ourselves more to the other points of view.
Terry? And you are muted, Terry.
Conversation acknowledges that this is an issue that is not relegated to certain parts of the country, that institutional racism is very much a part of American culture, and that for us to be in this conversation tonight, it's the first step to acknowledge that there is a problem, that is there needs to be acknowledgement by everyone, and I could understand why we were chosen to be part of this first conversation as leaders in the community. And I think that if this conversation wasn't started at all, that would be a problem. Especially in this time where we're all isolated by by what's happening with COVID-19. But I remember when Charlottesville happened, the response was to immediately organize and go in a vigil across from City Hall, and there were a large group there to again, in outrage of what happened there, and similar issues, and so we're doing what we can to share our outrage and to again provide some I guess a starting point to continue on this dialogue and see what we could do to help.
Thank you, Terry. And I think for me, and this ties in, Ian, with what you shared about community organizing, or at least it led me to that place, because when I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and when I was in 11th grade in high school, a white police officer, a very familiar story, a white police officer shot a young unarmed black man in the back as he was running away. And I, in a small way, got to be part of work in the city to try to create change, to have conversations like we're having tonight, and to try to address this injustice and to address all the injustice buried beneath it and all that led to it. And so many people work so hard, and we're so vulnerable and so honest, and especially leaders of color, and put it on the line. And in the end, nothing changed. The system just basically waited for the fervor to die down and resume status quo. And I, being sort of the naive, white privileged 11th grader that I was, I remember feeling this just despair and void of like, why wasn't all this work and all these conversations enough? And asking God that question. And the answer that I received in some manner was that at least I and some of the leaders, particularly the white leaders, had not taken the time to listen well enough, to build relationships well enough. It's one thing to talk about issues and to operate on that surface of social change and politics and whatnot. But it's another thing to really know one another, to sit with someone in their home and to find out what keeps them up at night because they're so scared and they're hurting so badly, or what they dream about and what their hopes are, and to build those relationships, to love them. And it was actually in that context that I felt a call to ministry, because ministry to me felt like a conduit for that kind of listening and that kind of love, while also pursuing social change. And that eventually led me to some community organizing, which, you know, the heart of that is that power is rooted in conversation, is rooted in relationships. And so while we don't want to stop with conversation, it is a starting place. It's a place for seeing and knowing, not just surface level, but far beyond. And I'm really looking forward to the four of us doing that and to seeing how that happens in the subsequent conversations. So I've shared a bit, I think probably already, my reaction, but I would love to hear from you three about your reaction when you first learned and as you learned more about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And please, again, dive in.
Unfortunately, it's a familiar storyline. And you have to acknowledge, I've had to acknowledge that this country is just perpetuating its culture of racism, and in parts of the country, a culture of lynching, really. It's more subtle than it was in the early 1900s, maybe, but it's just as insidious. And you have things like vigilantes and police shootings justified with sort of the same thin logic, or the distorted logic of built around lies and misstatements. And so outraged and despair, and what do you do? I know we have people harassed in Auburn for running for office, and there's people falsely accused of crimes, and there's mass imprisonment of minorities, and there's racial profiling, and as with Ahmaud, extrajudicial killings. I've been I think at the start of this virus, I had this inclination. I've been searching for involvement with a faith community committed to social change, and I'm open to any ideas you have, Reverend. Maybe it's your community I need to be a part of.
We would certainly welcome you, Dave, but there are others as well.
I like your voice. I like your message. I like your conviction. Yeah, I'll stop there and pass it on.
Thanks, Dave. Ian, Terry?
I can go unless you want to, Terry. I think I remember pretty distinctly, as we do when we're kind of pent up in the house, I guess, looking at my screen too much, right? And kind of scrolling quickly. And a few friends had shared this video, and there was no text or anything, so I'm kind of just scrolling quickly, and it's one of these things that just plays without you clicking on it, this video. And and it's very short, right? So it's some trucks, and a man runs out in front. There's a brief scuffle, and he runs away and falls to the ground, and then you realize that you've just witnessed a murder, without your consent. You just are scrolling through your feed, and in between pictures of puppies and your friends' children, there's a murder on your screen. It's not something that, the movie theater violence is not, that's not, you're seeing kind of someone's candle of life snuffed out. And so that really kind of rattled me for a good moment. And I didn't even know anything about Ahmaud or anything else, or what the circumstances were until I kind of read further. And, and I think, I don't have to worry about that when I go for a run. I honestly think it looked like a familiar scene to me as I run across South Street and cars are going by, and I stop for the cars or I run in front of the cars. Never would I think a car is following me and hunting me down through a neighborhood. And I think the thing that got me even more was the next day I'm watching CBS Saturday Morning, and the rhythm of the stories are always the same, right? So someone is killed, a man is killed, and then it's, did he walk into a building that he wasn't supposed to be in when he was out for his run? What should he have been in that neighborhood? No one would ask those questions of me. I'm running through Auburn all the time. There's signs that say, no authorized traffic, and I'm seeing, children and their fathers fishing in the same area. There's no threat. They're not worried about anything happening to them. So the thin, bizarre justifications that happen every time, right? Breonna Taylor killed, that we find out later in the week in her own home. And then, the next day, well, they went to the wrong site, but maybe this and maybe that. And it's like, I can't even believe that would never happen. It never does happen if a white person is killed. And I just think that is the disgusting part, that is kind of enabled, that there's a both sidesism to somebody getting murdered when it is a person of color, especially a Black man. So
Terry?
I'm there.
Similar to Ian, I found out on social media, and again, there would be friends that would post, I did not see the video first. I was informed by a friend, very socially active friend, that was forwarding a petition by Sean King. When I found out more, I obviously, signed the petition and became involved that way. But it's not enough. I know that there was a solidarity movement on Monday to run with Ahmaud, and there's that, and whatever I could do, to show solidarity and outrage. And as I said, and as Dave and Ian indicated, this is not the first time something like this has happened, and it just gets worse every single time. And we can't be immune to this kind of violence and this kind of hatred that we see happen all too frequent these days.
Thank you, Terry. And no, I mean, as Ian, you were speaking to, play off Dickens, this is a tale of two worlds, right? So the world we experience and the world that people of color experience are very different, and there's a double standard. And part of that divergence is in what has come to be known as, this famous conversation that Black parents, every Black parent really, has with their children about police interactions and navigating the community and what to anticipate, and how we live in a world that is racist, that is going to be a danger to them, and so that they can be safe and be prepared. Do you have a conversation like that? And if so, what does it look like? Yeah, Terry.
I'll start with this one. I don't have a conversation, and I think that like that with my son, and that is indicative of the privilege of being white, but I have friends that are African American that have that conversation, and that it just shows the divide between my experience and their experience. So I don't, and it's my conversations, like New York State Fair, I was like, if you get lost, go to the state police, that's my conversation, with my son. And, but that, I think with me, it's, as I said, it's a different experience. And, I acknowledge that. And, I just wanted to answer the question honestly.
Mm-hmm. It is a different experience for us. My children, who are young adults now, never felt threatened in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities. That was not an issue. My daughter, when she was maybe 14, took a bus into Syracuse, and somebody grabbed her backpack, and so we had a discussion then about street smarts, which probably applies to anybody anywhere, when you're in an unfamiliar place, and I've had those conversations with my kids, but I have to admit, like you, Terry, that it was never a conversation about their safety or their wariness where we lived, where they ran, where they played. So I'll pass it on.
Thanks, David. Ian, anything to add here?
This is another place where my prism is lacking. I'm not a father, so I can't really share on this one. So I'll wait for the next one.
Sure. And I'll say, as the father of a child of color, who's not yet 2 years old, we haven't had much of the conversation yet, but we certainly will be. And that's something that I've already been to classes and received training in. And, it's something that breaks your heart. You have to sort of break the world to your child and tell them that, the world that's supposed to love them and be a good place isn't. And I know that, that same conversation is happening in other parts of my family, but I didn't have it, as with my parents, as talking to me, you have standard conversations that parents have with children about safety and risks out there, because there are plenty, but none based on the color of my skin. And that is the radical difference. And so none of us, and even I, in telling my son, is different. So none of us really, from what we've said, none of us can relate to that conversation. We don't know it. So there are both conscious and unconscious biases, right? Ones we're well aware of and ones that are embedded in us and our society, stereotypes, prejudices, assumptions, and the unconscious ones are especially pernicious because we're not even aware that they're there, and they're influencing our actions and our speech and our silence in ways that we don't realize. They're operating beneath the surface. So what role do you think these biases play in the perceptions and reactions to Black men, especially all people of color, but especially Black men, both right here in Auburn, Cuyahoga County, as well as nationally?
I think that the things that we call unconscious biases today are a result of a very deliberate system that began over 400 years ago, right? So, we learn about the slave trade in the history books, and we have to remember that there's no evolution between where we sit today in 2020 and where those human beings, their minds were the same and operated the same way as ours when they were forced on that slave ship. I think if you can imagine that, right? Imagine the inconvenience or even the real financial or safety harm that we're experiencing through this quarantine versus what those human beings experienced. As far as unconscious bias, one of the things that was said about Ahmaud was that wasn't his neighborhood, right? Whatever that means, right? We have housing that is built on redlining still to this day. Even if it's been made illegal, there's been no change in how segregated our housing stock is, right? So a person of color in a quote unquote white neighborhood is automatically looked upon with suspicion. So these unconscious biases are kind of very structural. And even if you do not have parents that taught you kind of racist behaviors, right? Which I'm thankful I did not have. Just because of the way that the society is structured, you pick up these unconscious biases about where people are supposed to be and how people are supposed to act based on the color of their skin. So I think that that's like something that we have to constantly be aware of. Is this is more than kind of our subjective experiences. There's actual structures that still need to be dismantled in 2020 to dismantle the unconscious biases that will exist for the next generation or for the generations that we are a part of today. So I try to think about what are the structures that still exist that we can fix. Poor representation in elected office for people of color, educators, there's not the representation of Black men in the classroom. I taught in Detroit. 100% of my students were African American. About 50% of the teachers were, right? So what does that instill in both the student and the teacher and in the administration? There's just kind of these things that just build up in someone's life over time that lead to these things. And we have to kind of examine those very thoughtfully and dismantle those. And we have those same structures here because we're no better than anywhere else. And so we have to work on those.
I agree with Ian that, besides the subjective personal day-to-day, awareness, or trying to dismantle the kind of the implicit bias that I have found myself being honest with myself about that. That's important to acknowledge and to continually fight, and that's something that is one thing. But I agree with Ian in the sense that there are there's the institutional racism that manifests itself in in some of our history, the laws that have happened in our history, whether it be the Jim Crow laws and or the Rockefeller laws. I mean, these were even just urban renewal, like these things that are racism in action, and they speak to us and they speak through us. And so we really have to come to terms with our history and be very conscious in fighting it, and trying to change that, and to realize this isn't just accidental, that there is definite intent in these kind of laws that are put into place, and perpetuating the institutional racism in our society.
Yeah, I agree, Terry. I've been noticing a lot in just kind of benign media, movies, the perpetuation of unconscious biases. Just a couple things I've seen in the last week, and I guess maybe being more attentive, because knowing this conversation was coming up, noticing the way Black people are portrayed. They're drug dealers, they're prostitutes, it's crazy, and that is just ongoing. But more personally, I mean, it's hard to dig deep. It really is, and to look at yourself, to look at however we frame it, whether it's a sort of survival technique. I mean, we look for differences, on the landscape. We look for things that are different, and in a predominantly white community, people of color are different. I mean, you notice they're different. It's just like it's an optic thing, and that is the unconscious bias that I carry. I'm sad to admit it, but it is, and that's just a starting point. So then you calculate. You have an encounter. I mean, I'm good at meeting people. I love talking to people of all types, and I love people of color, and I'm here in a rural America on the front line of white masculine patriarchy, and I guess I really have to ask myself how, in this context, can I interrupt the unconscious biases that pop up, you know? And when do I make that calculation, you know, to upset, let's say, a benign social gathering, you know, to call something out? It's a challenge, and I feel like it's an opportunity that this conversation has presented, to think about that and to act on it.
In light of what all of you have shared, I'm thinking about the complexity of identity, and you know how I am many different things, right? I'm a pastor, I'm a dad, I'm, you know, a son, a brother, you know, and I have different passions and joys, and you know, and so I'm many different things all at once, and I'm allowed to be, right? Someone meets me, they give me that chance to define who I am, and that's the way it should be, right? And so for people of color, that identity is just as complex and ranging. And, you know, when Ahmaud was jogging, could have seen a son, a family man, could have seen a neighbor, a man who cares about exercise. They could have seen, you know, a professional. They could have seen all different kinds of complex parts of his identity. But instead, he was just allowed to be one thing, and one thing that he wasn't even. And so this monolith is presented for identity, a totally conjured one, as you've said, deliberately, in order to perpetuate these systems of inequality and oppression. And so instead of allowing our neighbors of color to be the fully beautiful and complex human beings that they are, not just what we've named, but also gay or straight or cisgender or transgender, or what professions they have and what their family status is, and just the full range, what they love to do, their hobbies, all of that. Instead, Blackness becomes criminality, becomes something to fear, becomes threat, becomes foreign, other. And that's used to prompt and to justify this violence. And it's startling, though not surprising, how we see that coming up, you know, in all the coverage and the justifications of it. So, you know, given just the weight of those biases and those systemic structural injustices that have been internalized in us, I know, you know, in me and in all of us in our society, what do we do? I mean, what needs to happen in the non-minority community and community of that is white, particularly in Auburn, to ensure that our black sons and all people of color are physically, mentally, and spiritually safe? What do we do?
I guess I'll start with that one. I mean, I think that, you know, I think that there needs to be some kind of beacon, right, within the community that shows that there is, number one, acknowledgement, but also a community that welcomes them. And, you know, I know that there are organizations that exist. You know, I know, Patrick, you know, your church, you know, even though I don't belong to your church, I know that is a safe place to go to if it's so welcoming, the signs out in front, you know. So I guess what we need to do as the first is to make sure that there are beacons and ways in which people that are being marginalized, that they're not alone, that they do have allies, and I think that it's important to make those known. And as I said, there's groups like your church, the Harriet Tubman Troupe. There's Celebrate Diverse Auburn. I mean, there's more that I can mention, but almost like broadcasting these lighthouses to the community, especially in this time, so that so that minority communities don't feel alone, don't feel isolated, and again with that, that's when you see other places for action and coalition building and political action, and to really see the landscape of the community in a meaningful way.
I'll jump in here. I think that we have to constantly remind ourselves that these systems have been built up over hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And what we also have to keep in mind is we have to have an urgency to dismantle those systems, not in hundreds and hundreds of years, right? But in our lifetimes, so that, as we move away from the Emancipation Proclamation and into segregation and Jim Crow, and now Jim Crow is over, but these extrajudicial killings still continue. How do we make 2 generations of progress in our lifetime? How do we make 3 generations of progress in our lifetimes, right? And I think that mindset is the mindset we have to have, and we have to, as white men, our role in that is we have to use the same privilege that allowed white men in the past to build up these systems to dismantle those systems. And we have to act with, force and in solidarity with people of color. But we have to, whenever we are given privilege, we have to acknowledge and understand that privilege, and then we have to use whatever space we have to break down those barriers. And I think, the spaces that I sit on, as a chair of the Democratic Committee, I have to think of people of color each time offices are up. I have to give them the supports they need to run successfully for office. As a school board member, what can I do, right? I can ensure that we have a more diverse staff. I can ensure that our students of color are cared for with culturally appropriate education, that they are not being subjected to the school to prison pipeline, all of those things, right? So you have to, I think each of us individually, whether we are white men or not, have to think about in our lifetime, what are we going to do to kind of break down those walls? And whenever we have the privilege or fortune to gain more, gain an elective office, gain some kind of leadership role in the community, we have to think about how we're going to use that new level that we've attained to break down those walls. So I try to do that often, but I think that, it's moments like this that we have to remind, am I doing everything I can to do that? Because if I'm not, then I'm not acting with appropriate urgency, and it will be another generation that Black men, Black women have to live with the systems that white men created. So these are wake-up calls, and we can't get used to the beats of these killings. We can't say, oh, there's another one tomorrow. This is this. It has to be a wake-up call every single time for our. It's so easy, just like people get used to school shootings or used to the latest thing to just tune it out and move on to the rest of your day, but you cannot do that. And this is a wake-up call to me. And I pledge not to become accustomed to these murders.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. This is a moment really created by the Angela and the Harriet Tubman group. And it sets it apart, and it is a challenge. I really look forward to the next 2 installments to witness the continuation of this conversation. And look forward to deeper conversations with people of color from my isolated rural setting here. I've been looking at ways to get more involved. There's it goes against my introvert tendencies, and that's my own issue. But I have to follow the momentum of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to doing that.
And presumably, Dave, I mean, that is one of the next steps for trying to ensure that Black sons are physically, mentally, and spiritually safe. It's those conversations. It's that listening. You know, it's knowing those Black sons, so that when we see Ahmaud jogging, he's not a stranger, and he's not a monolith, and he's not a stereotype. He's a person, complex and beautiful and wondrous, and just who he is uniquely. And that takes time and that takes work, but we have to cross boundaries of our communities and what are self-imposed or outwardly imposed, and know one another, love one another. And I mean, I'm conscious that churches are still largely segregated. And so if we're not building those relationships, then we're still going to be engaging in that otherizing and that simplifying and that dehumanizing and that violence against the other, whoever the other may be. And so how do we, get to know each other, get to love each other, I think is one of the steps that we need to take. I reminded of Martin Buber, this Jewish theologian, reflecting in, the context of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and a great dehumanization and violence. And he talks about the contrast between I-it relationships and I-thou relationships, right? So I-it regards the other as an object, as something for me to use, fear, whatever it may be, but it's for me. I-thou is to regard another human being inherently valued and lovely and complex unto themselves and for no other reason than for their inherent worth and just to meet them, no utility to me. And that's the kind of societal shift that I think we need. We've been trained in I-it relationships economically and politically and relationally as men, as white men. And that needs to change. And I think, part of that also then is if we have white children, having a conversation with them that says, if you see this happening, do something. Or if you, start noticing, pay attention to internalized messages and feelings and biases. We need to help our children not be the next generation to perpetuate these crimes, this violence. And I think we need also to get out of the way. Like, we've been occupying positions of privilege and power, and we hold on to them. Even when we're progressive, we still like to hold on to them, even in the progressive movements that are supposedly for the benefit of others. But we still get to be the ones to talk and lead, and you know, and we need to get out of the way. We need to have people of color, as well as LGBTQ people and immigrants and all people who occupy marginalized status and oppression within our community, they need to occupy places of authority so that perspective begins to change in institutions. And I mean, that's something we can do here in Auburn. Like you were saying, Ian, we can train our minds to ask that question every time. Who's not at this table? Who's not a part of this institution? Who is not a leader here? What does this room look like? Is it all white people? Is it all white men? Is it mostly? You know, and we're not talking about tokenism either. We're talking about a fundamental shift in leadership and in vision setting and in power. And that's not easy. I'll be honest, it's not easy for me. I'm a preacher and a white man, so I like to talk. But sometimes I need to shut up. And there are times I need to speak out too. But sometimes I also need to shut up and listen and make space for other voices. And I think that's something we could do right here in Auburn. We're gonna close here soon, and this really, you know, this extends on what we've been talking about in the soul of Black folks. W. Du Bois in 1933, he stated that the greatest ill of American society will always be sickness of race. In less than 13 years, that text will be 100 years old, and here we are. You know, and while Jim Crow may not look the same, Michelle Alexander has through her research, has shown us how Jim Crow continues through mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline. And so these realities, they stay with us. They just change their surface appearance. So in addition to what you've said, what are we calling on white Americans to do? Because if the problem comes from us, if we're at the root of it, okay, and it's our job to fix it, what are we calling on white Americans to do to address this illness that plagues our nation? And frankly, I mean, do you believe that you and we have the skills to do it?
I don't think, obviously, I don't think we could do it alone. You know, I think it's, you know, as you indicated, it's, you know, knowing when to get out of the way, knowing when to be a partner, knowing when to be an ally, and like, you know, identify as a coalition on a, you know, unified. And, you know, I know President Barack Obama is speaking tonight to graduates across the nation. And, you know, if I may share, I think this can help answer that question. Just a quote from tonight's speech. Reverend, is it okay if I share it?
Please do.
Okay.
Please do.
So President Obama says, first, make sure you ground yourself in actual communities with real people, working whenever you can at the grassroots level. The fight for equality and justice begins with awareness, empathy, passion, even righteous anger. Don't just activate yourself online. Change requires strategy, action, organizing, marching, and voting in the real world like never before. No one is better positioned than the class of graduates to take that activism to the next level. And from tackling health disparities to fighting for criminal justice and voting rights, so many of you are already doing this. Keep on going. So, you know, it is us. It is, you know, the white males that benefit from the privilege, but it is also the young that need examples, need to know that there are allies that are older of different ethnicities, different socioeconomic backgrounds. I think that the call to action is to do what President Barack Obama said, is to really organize and to become a coalition that is able to defend ourselves from this institutional racism, defend ourselves and fight and dismantle, as Ian says so eloquently, dismantle these institutions that have been building for 400 years. It is urgent, as President Obama's speech is, now urgent more than ever, the call to action. And, that's what we need to do here locally.
Thank you, Terry. Ian or David, anything to add about what we're calling on? Create change?
I think that your question was, how can we change? I think it's a million some small things that each of us individually need to do. It's a mindset that we must be a part of, and if you have more to give, you must give more. I think the thing that a thought that I wanted to end with is this crisis, this kind of pandemic that we are experiencing and hoping to end in some way soon, is affecting people of color more than it is affecting white people throughout our community. And why is that? I mean, we have a system that has kind of perpetuated less access to healthcare, less access to resources of all kinds for years and years and years. Black women are shown to be treated differently during childbirth. Their pain tolerances seem to be higher. So how does that affect their care when they are treated for an illness? Who are the people that are keeping places like New York City, the epicenter of this crisis, going? It is people of color. There's a heartbreaking story in the Post-Standard about the immigrants that are sleeping 4 to a room, even if that they know that they have COVID-19. They're keeping them in these hotels. And there's no consequence for the people that are doing these things. I think that if anything comes from this, it needs to be a return to basic human empathy. You need to see like a kind of living willow structure underneath the ground. Those willows are all connected to one another. They have the same root structure. It's all intertwined and interlocked. We, as a humanity, are part of the same living structure. And an injury to one human being needs to be seen as an injury to all. And when you see someone murdered on TV, you cannot turn it off. That is your brother, that is your sister. And when someone is treated less than human, miles from your home, as they are being treated at this factory, or in our county, the man, I don't know his conditions, but the man who passed away was a farm worker. We can't think of it as someone other or someone not from our community that is dying from this, because the things that happened to Ahmaud Arbery could have easily happened to our community. A very similar incident happened 2 years ago, where a man drunk with a gun showed up at a person of color's home. And thankfully nothing too violent happened, but it could have easily happened. So we can't think that we're better than other human beings, other communities. We have to start now before these tragedies visit our communities in a more real way. So that's going to be my challenge. I'm not going to kind of challenge people through the internet to do the same, but I think it's a mindset that we all have to take on. So thank you.
Ian, I'm feeling you so much right now. That was really beautiful. And I mean, when I saw what happened to Ahmaud, I saw my son. You know, right now he's 2, a little before younger than 2, and he's cute. But there will become a point when he's older, well, he'll be jogging, and someone will see him as a threat. And I saw my son lying there, and that was terrifying and heartbreaking and outraging. And like you said, I mean, this isn't really going to change until we all see that, until we all see that that's our son lying there. I mean, in my tradition, you know, we would say exactly what you said, that, you know, Paul says we're all part of the body of Christ, that we're all interconnected, that we are part of this interconnected fabric. And what happens to one part affects all parts. When one suffers, we should all grieve. When one rejoices, we should all rejoice. And until we adopt that mentality and break this division that allows us to separate and dehumanize and not care about what happens to another because we think it somehow doesn't affect us, even though we are, as Martin Luther King said, you know, in this matrix of interconnection, you know, this isn't going to change. And so we need to see that it is our son, our brother, our sister, our father, our mother, our spouse is the one who is lying there in that street. It's probably the only motivation that's sufficient enough to get us to fight for this day in and day out. Dave, do you have any final thoughts?
I do have some skill and strength that I can engage to work at this. And I need to be attentive. I need to be committed. And I need to get comfortable, or not, that's a cliche, but I'm like tonight, diving into the uncomfortable. Yeah, I need to dive into the uncomfortable more earnestly, more vigorously. And I really look forward to the next opportunities. I'm not sure what will unfold, but even with you, gentlemen, and others, I hope to continue this.
Absolutely, because this has to not end. You know, if this is just us talking, that's great, but it's not going to really produce change until we commit to the next conversation and the next action and the next action. And I will share with you a question that we did receive via Facebook. We're not going to dive into it right now verbally because of the time, but I do invite us to hold this. And I think it speaks to much of what you were saying, Ian, and what we've been discussing throughout our time together. And it comes from someone on Facebook who asks, can we define who we are without, quote unquote, the other? And can white folks see themselves as, quote unquote, the other? So I leave us with that question because we want to receive that from the community that's watching right now, and we thank you for it. We thank you for watching with us, and we want to thank each of our panelists tonight, David Tobin and Terry Cuddy and Ian Phillips, and Auburn Public Theater and the Harriet Tubman Troupe, and all the leaders who made tonight possible, and all the leaders who are working every day, often at their own risk, at their own exhaustion, to create change, to protect the physical, mental, and spiritual safety and health of our Black sons and of all human beings. And so we carry from this a conviction to go forward and a commitment, I think, from all four of us, as well as everyone else, to take that next step. And I encourage everybody who's watching to tune in next time on Saturday at 7 p.m., also on Facebook Live, for a conversation much like this one, but instead exclusively among Black men and leaders in our community who will be wrestling with these questions as well in a very, and give us whole new insights and new perspectives into this. I know I'm very much looking forward to that. So unless panelists, any final word that you dying to really want to share? Okay. Thank you all. I bid you a good night, and let us say his name, Ahmaud Arbery. Let's say it over. Please, Terry.
Arbery.
Ahmaud Arbery.
Ahmaud Arbery.
Ahmaud Arbery.
Let's say it until the killing stops. Good night. See you next Saturday.